Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Trish Jackman and Rebecca Hawkins to the show. Great to have you both on.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Super excited to be talking with you both. Now, we always get started by guests introducing themselves to the Sports Psych Show audience. So why don't we start there? Trish, if you'd like to go first, tell us all about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at the University of Lincoln. So been there in that role for just under 5 years now, but completed my PhD there prior to that as well. And I'm also the lead of Lincoln Sport and Exercise Psychology Research.
It's a beautiful city, but you don't sound like you grew up there, Trish.
No. So I grew up on the south coast, and that still very much is home for me at the south coast of Ireland. So I'm from Waterford.
Okay, nice.
Famous for its crystal, amongst other things, and a beautiful coastline. So yes, I've been here for a number of years now, but always tried to get back. And until COVID and the pandemic happened, I was still playing sport at home as well. So yeah, certainly not a Lincolnshire accent, although I think sometimes my Waterford and my Irish accent does wane a little, but it does get topped up when I do go home.
It's also incredible golf country as well around that area.
Yes, indeed.
And Rebecca Hawkins, it's great to have you here as well. Why don't you introduce yourself, if that's okay?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, similar to Trish. So I'm a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at the University of Lincoln. Similar to Trish as well, my entire academic background is at Lincoln. So undergrad, masters, and then I'm currently doing a part-time PhD under Trish's supervision at the university alongside my teaching role. So busy at the minute. And yeah, Lincoln's been my home for the last 11 years now, but you probably can't tell my accent quite as strongly as Trish's. No. So I'm from Suffolk originally, so losing my accent a little bit, but not too far from home.
I can detect a slight Suffolk accent there, a slight one. And we always follow introductions with a brief sort of history as to sporting achievement or sporting interests. So Trish, I mean, you mentioned there that you head back home and actually play sport. What's your sporting background, Trish? What sports did you play? What did you love? What sort of level did you get to, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so I played basketball actually until mid-adolescence, but I suppose my main sport has been camogie, which for those who may be familiar with Gaelic games, it's the women's version of hurling. So I played that with my club Galtier, played with my county Waterford for over a decade as well. We experienced a lot of success, thankfully. We kind of rose through the ranks. So we started off, I guess, really in the third tier. And by the time I played my last game a couple of years ago, we were in the top 6 in the country, which, was a real sign of progress for us. So yeah, camogie has been my main sport. COVID obviously has had an impact on that because we'd won the national club final. I think a week before pretty much everything started to go into shutdown. So since then I haven't played, but I've taken up running. So I've been doing a lot of running for the last couple of years. Ran my first race last summer, which was an ultra marathon. And I've been having a little bit of fun doing some cross countries and trail races over the winter this year. So that's pretty much me. I've get a lot of enjoyment from challenging myself, seeing new places. The running is definitely new because I'm quite a way down the pack usually when it comes to these things, but it's great enjoyment. And yeah, for me, it's getting out in the morning, 6, 6:30, and at this time of year, it's really beautiful as well to be out there in the peace and quiet. So yeah, it's very much about my mental well-being as much as the physical when it comes to running for me.
Well, I was going to ask you, when you attempted your first race last year, were you using all of your techniques on yourself?
Yeah, I think so. It definitely helped. Somehow I managed to get to about 4 hours before I I started to need a podcast or something or other to keep me going. But yeah, it's been interesting, and it's a good experience. You certainly learn to get more content with yourself when you are ultra training, because you have to be out there for a lot of hours to just be able to get to the start line. So it's an interesting experience.
It exhausts me even thinking about doing that. And so, Rebecca, what about yourself? Sporting background, what sports did you play? And how come sports psychology?
Yeah, so I can't follow Trish's star-studded account there of her sporting background, but my sporting background is entirely in football. Played football from a young age, all the way up into my mid-20s before, sadly, injury forced me out of it. I just haven't got the knees for football, apparently. That's what I've been told anyway. Um, so yeah, I represented my county and played for a lot of years, but it did sadly have to come to an end. But transferred into coaching quite seamlessly. So I've done quite a lot of coaching ever since. I take time to do things like my coaching badges outside of my academic life, and yeah, I get a lot of pleasure from doing that in my spare time.
It's nothing like being in your mid-20s playing sport and a physio comes along saying you haven't got the knees for this.
Definitely.
It
Well,
makes you feel a bit old, even in your mid-20s.
I probably got told it a few years before after the second time I did the same injury, but
Oh, right.
the third time you tear an ACL, you get told no, I think.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, look, that's so cool because there's such a diverse range of sports here that we can lean on when we talk about our subjects today. And I'm so excited to be talking about the subject that we are going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about goal setting. We're going to be talking about which is going to lead us on to clutch and flow states. We're going to be leaning on the research that you've both been engaged in up there in Lincoln and globally, because I know you link up with a couple of previous guests on the show, such as Dr. Christian Swan and Dr. Matt Schweikel. So it's so cool to have you both on talking about this stuff. I mean, let's start with the goal setting, because last month we released an episode on the Sports Psych Show where I was talking with Dr. Christian Swan about goal setting and smart goal setting, but we happened upon open goals. And if anybody listens to that, they can hear me get very excited about open goals in the last 15 or 20, probably far too excited than I should be about the subject of open goals. But it really fascinated me. And after the episode was finished, Christian said to me, Dan, you have got to talk to Trish and Rebecca because they are studying this stuff every single day of their lives. They're studying open goals. So let's start there. And I think, to start our deep dive here, Trish, why don't you give us a bit of background related to open goals? Any sort of, I don't know whether it's theoretical underpinnings or just some history here, and we can build from there.
Yeah, so I'll start out really as to where this idea of open goals came from, and it very much is rooted in some of the work by your previous guest, Christian Swan, and his work in relation to psychological states underlying exceptional performances. So I'll bring you back initially to one of his studies, which is in 2016, which many of your listeners may have read. It has one of those titles that you probably remember the paper by the title, and it's the Letting It Happen and Making It Happen paper, where he followed I guess it was built on from his initial work, but he interviewed golfers, really top level golfers after exceptional performances, and was interested in learning about their experiences in those particular rounds of golf that they'd finished out. So some of them maybe won a tournament, finished really high up on the leaderboard. And I guess from the work initially, it was an interest in exploring kind of flow, because that was the experience that many had described, and that was the typical way we understood exceptional performances. But I guess through that work, some of the golfers explain that sometimes we go out into a round of golf and we're very much just letting it happen, and very much aligned with this idea of flow and this effortless kind of experience that we may have. But then some of them also reported this other type of experience, which was still being described, I guess, or characterizing their experience during these exceptional performances, but they referred to it as a much more effortful type of experience, and as though they were making it happen. And I guess that was something quite novel in the field, because this idea of flow had been the typical perspective that I guess people had approached optimal performance states from. And within that work, one of the, I guess, more nuanced aspects was that when these golfers referred to this state of making it happen, this tended to arise when it was kind of towards the end of the tournament, for example, when maybe more pressured situations, and also at times when they were after setting and they were pursuing a more of a specific goal. So whether that was to shoot a certain score in the round, and so on. Whereas for flow, this tended to be described earlier in the tournaments. But what was really interesting about these states of flow and when they were letting it happen is that the golfers were setting more open-ended goals. So they weren't necessarily measurable. They weren't necessarily outcome focused. They were, very much more exploratory and almost, just seeing how I can do on this hole, see how I can do on the round. Um, and that, I guess, from there, Christian terms that an open goal because of the fact that it didn't have that kind of specific end point. And I guess that's kind of carried through. He built on that work. So the study in 2017, the integrated model of flow and clutch states, which is where that study, I guess, started to broaden out to a wider sample of athletes. So in this study, we recruited 25 athletes in total. And again, these were from a range of different sports. And similar to the golfers, they described these two states, flow and clutch. And at this point, I guess the term for making it happen was then, I guess, referred to as a clutch state. And I guess that will link to some of the work Matthew Schweikel will have spoken about previously as well. So this idea of clutch performance being increased performance under pressure. And I guess that's where this idea of clutch state and that term came about, because even though this phenomenon of clutch performance had previously been described in the literature, we didn't really have a term to describe the experience of it. And that's, I guess, where this term clutch state was used, because when athletes were describing this more effortful type of experience, it tended to occur in pressured situations. So what we saw in that integrated model was that flow and clutch, they shared some characteristics, but there were some very distinct characteristics to those experiences. And again, very much similar to the golfers, when the athletes were reporting this clutch state, it was much more about these specific fixed goals, whereas for flow, it was much more about these open goals. So a runner might, set a goal more spontaneously in the performance, or just see how far I can move forward in the performance, see how quick I can run, and again without that specific end point. So that probably gives a bit of a sense of where this originated. And I guess since then there's been a number of different studies published. So through some of my own work in my PhD, some more qualitative work. We've also seen some more recent work as well from Patrick Boudreau and colleagues who were looking at adventure recreation as well. So that was published in Psychology of Sport and Exercise. And also Christian led another paper that a number of us worked with him on, and that was in relation to flow and clutch, specifically in exercise. And I guess that body of work is really where this idea of open goals first came about. And from there, it's then transitioned into some more experimental work, which Rebecca has been one of the main contributors to. So that's a little bit of a background before we move on to the experimental aspects.
Well, that's fascinating, and I definitely want to unpack some of that flow and clutch stuff, of course, relating it to open and specific goals, but maybe even having a deeper dive into flow and clutch states, because I know you were both involved with the research paper to do with the integrated models of optimal experience. But coming over to you, Rebecca, as Trish mentioned there, you've done quite a lot of experimental work around, let's say, open goals versus specific goals. I know it's broader than that, but this is actually the basis of your PhD. So, almost taking a slight step back here, Rebecca, tell us a little bit about your interest in goal setting, where this comes from, and then maybe you can unpack some of the stuff you're doing around open goals as well.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So to build on where Trish has come from here in terms of the flow and clutch literature, and then how it's translated into this goal setting and physical activity kind of concept that we've got going on now,
Yep.
It was really, again, building on some of Christian Swan's work. And obviously, just for context, Christian is the other part of my supervisory team. So credit where credit's due. Trish and Christian are a formidable team there. And I've got some great backing behind me.
Perfect.
But Christian and one of, I believe, his former colleagues, Simon Rosenbaum, really presented this idea of, if there are these open goals originating in flow experiences or these positive, rewarding experiences in sporting context, then how and is there any way that these translate to exercise experiences or physical activity experiences? And they presented really a snapshot of this idea in a journal in the British Medical Journal, that open goals or potentially the use or overuse of specific, measurable, attainable or achievable goals or time-based goals,
Yes.
that maybe they're actually problematic in physical activity contexts. So when we consider things to be complex or a difficult task, as we can argue that physical activity is, if we say that somebody has to, organize, prioritize being physically active, they have to be sufficiently motivated, committed to their goal, they have to fit it into their, routine. We can argue that being physically active is potentially complex and potentially difficult for somebody to get involved in and continue and to maintain. And actually, if we go right back to goal setting theory, we look at Locke and Latham's original work and their sort of statement of goal setting theory in their 1991 paper. They actually state that when we're trying for a specific challenging goal, that might actually hurt performance in certain circumstances. So those certain circumstances being when somebody is new to a task or when a task is complex. So Christian then really took that idea and translated that into physical activity promotion and put forward the case that, well, if physical activity is complex, then should we be recommending these specific goals or these specific challenging or SMART goals that we see so commonly used? And that paper, therefore, and that idea really forms the foundation for where my PhD has come in to then take this idea and challenge this idea and investigate this idea a little bit more.
So what are some of the findings that you're experiencing?
Yeah, so I think there have been a couple of key studies from this line of inquiry. Certainly there's another couple from Christian students over in Australia that have contributed to this body of work. And there was some initial evidence to suggest that these open goals in a simple 6-minute walking task might elicit, slightly more positive experiences from the perspective that somebody might want to or have more interest in repeating the session, so doing the session again or responding to that goal again. And equally, they found that SMART goals, typically, or specific goals, resulted in higher feelings of pressure or tension in these individuals. So my first study of the PhD came in to take that a step further. So what I looked to do was similar study design where we've got, a 6-minute walking test. We're taking a snapshot of physical activity and we're asking individuals to respond to different types of goals. So a specific goal, an open goal, included a do your best goal in there just to complicate things, and a control condition. So a do your best goal, just for context, simply saying do your best on this activity. But the key thing about a do your best goal is that it has a marker of best. Somebody knows what their previous performance might be or can have a gauge of their previous performance in comparison to these open goals, which are very much exploratory. See what you can do. There's no pre-performance sort of marker that they can attach themselves to. So I set out to replicate in many ways that simple walking task, 6-minute walk task with these different goal conditions. But the way I was trying to advance knowledge on what we had at that current time point is that we're arguing that we need to tackle those who are new to physical activity. That's where the problem is, right? We've got these, individuals maybe who aren't active enough and need to get active and maintain their activity. So research to the point where I came in had previously been on healthy adults. So people who were highly active, moderately active, or there were a couple, I think there were 15 participants in the sample that I'm referring to who were low activity. So I set out to really test that directly. I had a group of insufficiently active participants who are currently doing less than 60 minutes of physical activity a week. And I had a high activity group, so a group of individuals who are doing more than 150 minutes of physical activity a week. So trying to really tap into that question of, okay, if physical activity is complex for these people who need to be more physically active, which goals are going to work for them? And that was really the rationale for the study. And interestingly, when we compare those two groups of participants, the findings were quite, outstanding, I think, in terms of, I wasn't certainly, thinking that they would result in what we actually found. It was, the most interesting was that there was a difference in how far people walked. So when the insufficiently active group were assigned an open goal, they walked further compared to a specific goal. But when we looked at the active group walked further in the specific or the SMART goal condition in comparison to the open goal condition. More importantly than that, though, is the markers of enjoyment and pleasure. So the insufficiently active group enjoyed and got more pleasure from the open goal condition, whereas the active group enjoyed and got more pleasure from the specific goal condition. So if we go back to theory again, it's kind of supporting Locke and Latham's original theory that these people who, for physical activity, isn't a complex task, they're utilizing and being effective and performing well and enjoying the goal condition with a specific goal, whereas the insufficiently active group, who maybe physical activity is complex for, it's difficult, it's challenging, they responded more favorably to the open goal. And one further, sort of interesting finding as well is that they wanted to do that exercise again. They had more or greater intentions to exercise again, which, if we fundamentally think about physical activity promotion, getting people active, then ultimately we want them to enjoy their exercise, experience pleasure, and we want them to want to do the activity again. So sorry, I've probably waffled on a little bit there, but in a quite a little bit of a nutshell, that was the key findings from my first study.
No, I love it, and I think, coming back to you here, Trish, listening in, because you're supervising Rebecca here, and you're involved in these studies. And what I'm hearing, if I'm, let's say, I don't know, a strength and conditioning coach in a gym, a personal trainer, and I'm interested in getting people active, if I want them to experience enjoyment so they'll come back, there's a level of complexity here. And if I've probably listened in to certain training courses that have said set goals, set stretch goals, set specific goals, what I'm hearing from Rebecca here is that, well, hang on, this is actually more complex than that. And actually, empirical evidence is suggesting that for beginners, those who don't do a lot of physical activity, should actually be engaged in these open goals. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, I think the big thing from this line of work to, I guess, well, one big important point to take from it is that we can't have a one size fits all approach. And I think that's particularly important if we look at the goal setting literature more broadly. We know that there are different theories that are out there. We know there are different types of goals. And if we look at often how goal setting is recommended, it's pretty much a standard approach that people are encouraged to take. And even if we look more broadly at how goal setting is taught, for example, to students, practitioners, and so on, it tends to be in a fairly straightforward kind of fashion. A lot of the time, focus more on those specific SMART goals. Whereas I think what this work is highlighting is that actually we need to consider the individual, and also consider, how are we applying theory? And I think that's probably something that Christian Swan will have touched on in a previous episode, in terms of the application of some of these goals. And what is obviously very noteworthy from this work that Rebecca has undertaken is the importance of affect and enjoyment. And we know from the work of Professor Paddy Akikakis, for example, and that real focus on hedonic aspects within our field, and the focus that we need to direct towards that, and the importance of pleasure, that this work around open goals and specific goals and suggesting that there are difference in the affective responses in these groups is particularly key, because we know that affect during an activity is a really strong predictor of long-term engagement. So from that perspective, I think that the crucial elements here is that this work highlights the need to move away from that one-size-fits-all approach. And I guess at this point, we're probably in the position that we need to expand the research to kind of look at longer time frames, which is something Rebecca is working on at present, to see how do these findings compare over a longer time frame. But thus far, I think some of this work offers some really valuable contributions in terms of highlighting that we need to have a much more nuanced approach in terms of working with people.
I think important probably underestimates it. I think it could be a real differentiator here, listening to what you're both saying. And I'm thinking here, because you mentioned this word quite a lot, Trish. Affect. Affect is in feeling. Yes, that's what you meant. Yes, feeling. So feeling, as you said, hedonic. Hedonic, like a feeling state, feeling enjoyment. I think this is really fascinating, because we're kind of skirting two worlds here. We're skirting we're not skirting anything, actually. We're specifically talking about physical activity, and we've alluded to earlier, performance sport, which we will absolutely come back to. But there's a relationship here, flow, clutch. I'm almost thinking of some of those beginner physical activity participants, the participants who didn't necessarily engage much in physical activity, how, if they had a specific goal, that they might actually go into a clutch state more than a flow state. Maybe we'll get your comments on that, Rebecca, because I might be talking a load of rubbish there. But what it makes me think is that obviously there's a call for the general public to exercise more, to engage in physical activity. And that is often related, the messages are often related to health messages and general fitness messages. But what's interesting is, are we missing a piece here in terms of feeling, hedonic sort of state, hedonic tone, affect? enjoyment, and actually these open goals, helping people get into environments when they're going to experience physical activity, setting them open goals in order to enjoy the experience rather than specific goals. This actually feels like something that could be a strong mediator of physical activity. This sounds like it could be a big deal. No question, Rebecca, just my rambles. Any thoughts on all of that?
No, it sounds like you've hit the nail on the head there. You're certainly getting the crux of the problem here, in that, as Trish alluded to, affect and that idea of pleasure versus displeasure during an activity really does underpin, our future exercise intentions, how likely we are to engage in activity again. So if we can use goal setting or a goal type as a strategy for eliciting those more positive, effective responses, then that really is a key thing that we need to be targeting from a physical activity promotion perspective. And as well as we look at, as Trish alluded to build on it, this idea of effect during the activity is key. So actually experiencing pleasure whilst you're engaging in that activity is just as important as an effective response after the activity. We know from the work of Paddy Ekakakis and his colleagues that this idea of the rebound effect and capturing that rebound effect is not a stronger predictor as if you've experienced pleasure during an activity. So again, that was one thing that a previous maybe methodological issue within the field that I set out to try and overcome in that first paper, because we look to capture, feeling states during participation in the activity, and actually those feeling states were more positive for those who were inactive in the open goal condition, which is a more or better predictor of whether or not they would exercise again, as opposed to if I'd have maybe just captured that rebound effect following that exercise. So yeah, I think you're getting the crux of the issue here, is that, there's more to physical activity and sustaining physical activity, and is that potentially in that effective response, that enjoyment, as opposed to just go out and do this many minutes per week each week.
And so what's I think Trish briefly mentioned what's next for this line of research. Sticking with the physical activity for a few more minutes, what is next, Rebecca? What's your next research projects around open goals and physical activity?
Yeah, so I've been certainly have collected a lot of data recently, but to talk to you first about the second study, so the follow-up study to this experimental study we're referring to, I actually used a qualitative method. So we interviewed participants to kind of try and understand these experiences of a specific goal, an open goal, a do your best goal in that experimental condition or in that experimental investigation. And just to give you a snapshot of some of those results, we were kind of finding that the insufficiently active group maybe didn't have the same capacities that some of the active group had. They weren't able to make use of self-regulation strategies or various, pacing techniques, stride length, or using things like self-talk to actually manage their performance in response to a specific goal. And actually the open goal took away that need or that metacognitive load that they were experiencing, and in trying to have to deal with, okay, how do I improve my performance by that many meters or by that much distance? And that cognitive load was sort of more reduced by just having an exploratory goal of see how well you can do. So the next study is really this qualitative follow-up, trying to gain a more in-depth insight into what is it about the open goal that makes it this more positive experience, or maybe what is it about a specific goal that maybe doesn't result in such a positive experience in these insufficiently active individuals. And then to take it a step further, in line with what Trish mentioned, looking at open goals and their capacity over an extended period of time. I'm currently in the midst of data collection at the minute of looking at open goals over, a week or 2 week period and seeing how do they work in the longer term. We know they work in a snapshot in a lab-based environment, but how do they work in practice? How do people respond to these over a week? And how do they compare to that specific goal that we're all used to setting ourselves?
You mentioned the words cognitive and metacognitive, I suppose essentially thinking and thinking about your thinking, to put it in basic terms. I'm just absolutely fascinating stuff, Rebecca, and I'm going to keenly follow that line of research as it progresses. You know, cognitive, metacognitive. It seems unsurprising that an open goal turned down the volume of cognition and metacognition by the sounds of what you said for those who weren't necessarily physically active. Aligning this with the research paper around flow and clutch states experienced in recreational distance running. I mean, this is a paper that you were both involved with alongside. This is like a multiple sports site show participant investigation. It's like there's both yourselves. There's Amy Whitehead, and Noel Brick, both of whom have been on the Sports Site show. So I think that's an achievement for the Sports Site show. Multiple researchers, and they've all been on the show. Brilliant. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that cognition and metacognition is involved in clutch state rather than flow state. Would I be getting that right, Trish? And what's the relationship there with open goals and specific goals?
Yeah, so the paper that we published in last year in Psychology of Sport and Exercise, so we specifically interviewed recreational runners after positive and rewarding experiences in non-competitive runs. And we're interested again using this event-focused interview approach in exploring their experiences, but also interested in connecting some of this work on flow and clutch and optimal experience to this literature on self-regulation, so how we monitor and control our thoughts, for example, or the achieve or pursuit of goals. And I guess that's very much where a lot of Noel Brick's work in particular, kind of we drew upon a lot of that field of research to, I guess, just adopt a very different perspective to looking at flow and clutch. And I think one of the really interesting findings, and it's not too dissimilar to what we found previously, but that many of these runners actually at different points in these runs, in the same run, may have had an open goal, and then later in the run they switched to a specific goal, for example. So it wasn't necessarily the case that they would focus on one goal for the entire of a run, but they may actually switch and change between these. And often what we found was that actually earlier in the run, when they had these more flow types of experiences, that's when they tended to report these more non-specific goals, including an open goal. Whereas later on in the run, potentially it could be due to just the fact that they're getting more fatigue. Maybe it was a longer run. Maybe it was part of their plan to have certain kind of intervals or whatever it may be later in the session, whatever it was, that we tended to find that people would then set more specific goals towards later on in the run. And one of the key things in terms of looking at those more non-specific goals is that it often tended to, the runners tended to then report kind of more of a relaxation of cognitive control, and often this kind of sense of maybe they were more distracted. So they may focus on the scenery, they might be having a conversation with somebody, they might be listening to music. And again, linking that back to some of what you mentioned there around metacognition, we kind of interpreted that from this perspective of the feeling of ease, and also that sense that we didn't necessarily have that sense of something signaling that we needed to engage control. So there was that sense that you were running more automatically, because again you weren't engaging control over your running technique. It was very much happening more effortlessly. And again, that also links back to in terms of the body and the internal sensory monitoring and how the runners felt, that they were fresh, they weren't feeling any discomfort, there was no fatigue, and so on. Whereas later on in the run, or when they were pursuing these more specific goals, it tended to be more effortful, and then in turn, I guess, signaling that need to engage more control. So to use the likes of the self-talk strategies, they would report that then, or to use strategies such as focusing on their technique, their pacing, and so on. So there were some of the differences that we kind of interpreted from this work in terms of these non-specific goals and these more specific goals. And I guess that the important point for that is to highlight potential differences in terms of those more task-specific strategies or goal-specific strategies that may be most useful in those particular contexts. And again, this is based on kind of our study in running, and we'd hope to kind of build more evidence around this, explore it in different areas as well. So that's kind of been that initial starting point where we've been looking at flow and clutch and also connecting it to this self-regulation literature as well.
So flow being a sense of enjoyment, and clutch not necessarily being enjoyable. You're pushing through. It can be hard. It can be effortful. So I suppose a question for either of you, and please feel free to give me your own individual opinions here. If I'm a recreational runner, and there's just so many people I think who probably listen in who enjoy doing a 5K and park run here in the UK, or they enjoy doing a local 10K, or perhaps some are more serious. Is the suggestion potentially here that one might start with, obviously it sounds like there needs to be a degree of flexibility, which one could argue is a skill in and of itself around goal setting. But one might start with this notion of, well, I'm just going to go out there and see how I go, and just let's just go and run. And then during the race, during the run, you might reassess that goal. You might actually start to, depending on how you're going or what's happening or how you're feeling, you might actually start to set a more specific goal. What's your thoughts on that notion there? To either of you, to both of you.
Yeah, so on the first point as regards enjoyment, I think one of the key things is that for the runners that we interviewed in that particular study that spoke about positive and rewarding experiences, I guess that in terms of that affective response and that pleasure, what a lot of the runners described was that during this flow state, they tended to find that more pleasant during the experience, and that's very much where the affective, I guess, the benefits of it really were described. But for the runners who described more clutch states, what was really interesting there was that sense that they, on reflection and retrospectively looking back on it, they felt, oh, I enjoyed that. But actually, the act of doing it wasn't necessarily perceived as something that in the moment that they had enjoyment. So I think if we consider this, there's this really interesting idea of the effort paradox, and that sense that even though the effort is costly, it's nonetheless valued, because afterwards we actually look back and we think, I'm really satisfied with that, and I really enjoy kind of achieving my goal, which was the case for these particular runners. So I think we also need to consider the time aspect and whether it's kind of that concurrent enjoyment and pleasure, or it's that retrospective looking back on it. But then you brought up a really interesting point, because I'm actually leading a study at the minute with a number of colleagues, including Amy Whitehead, Noel Brick, and Christian Swan, where we have actually interviewed runners in races and similar to what you've said there. There's a real variety in terms of the types of goals people will set before a race, and whether they persist with those goals or whether they actually make adjustments to those goals. And hopefully over the next few months we will be able to share that work more widely. But I think you pointed out a really important aspect here, which is this notion of flexibility. And I think that's a really important aspect for us to consider because, again, linking to some of the work on goal striving by Nikos Antimanis and other colleagues in that particular around goal striving and how actually being flexible in relation to our goals can be really, really important. And not just from the perspective of, when we pursue a goal, if actually continuing to pursue that goal could have maladaptive outcomes, well, the best, I guess, decision in those scenarios often is to disengage from that goal and let go and adjust to something else. But I guess equally on the other side of it, sometimes as athletes, if we're going really well in a race, actually we may also want to adjust our goal upwards. So moving forward, I guess over the next few months, hopefully we'll be able to share more of that work. But as you said there, I think what's really important for us to consider is that notion of flexibility. And, as athletes, when we go out into a performance, generally speaking, we're going to be monitoring how we're doing. And, having that kind of rigid goal potentially could lead to an underperformance in the sense that we mightn't necessarily kind of stretch ourselves a bit further. But equally, if we stick with it and it's not necessarily going to produce the best outcomes in term for us, that may have a negative impact. So I guess, as you said, the key thing is really being able to be flexible in the moment and preparing athletes, I guess, is another consideration. How do we go about doing that moving forward as well?
Rebecca, if you were to go out and run a 10K tomorrow, if you were involved in a race, given your knowledge of goals, how would you go about this from a goal setting perspective? Everything that, given everything that Trish has said there, given what you've been researching, how would you go about this? And feel free to go back to football as well. When you reflect on you're playing football, is what you're researching here, when you reflect back, would you perhaps go out there and would you have, if you could get in a time machine, let's look at it like this, would you change the kind of goals you had in football? So running and football.
Well, I'll stick with running first of all, because I think it's actually appropriate, given that for me to go out and run a 10K would be a pretty big challenge right now.
Okay.
So actually, it would be very appropriate for me to set myself an open goal. Given that 5K is probably more my limit at the minute, if I went to try and do the 10K, a see how well you could do goal might actually treat or serve me quite well, because I would then simply be exploring what I could achieve and how well I could achieve. Whereas certainly for the context that Trish is talking about with, more experienced runners or those individuals that maybe have the capacity to be more flexible in their goals, I think the key from my research perspective and the sort of time point we're at the minute is working out more how long these goals are effective for or might be effective for. So if we take that initial open goal, yes, if I go out and do the 10K for the first time, the open goal might be, really beneficial. It might allow me to explore what I can do, get a marker and sort of see where I'm at and see how well I can do. But actually over time, how does the effectiveness of that work? Is it that to continue to use an open goal is going to serve me as the most beneficial strategy? Or where is it that we get to a stage where we become experienced enough, or that activity is no longer complex to us, and therefore we can transition into using something like a specific goal? And I think that's where my research is going at the minute in trying to sort of figure that out. And obviously we know it's not a one size fits all approach, but is there anything we can apply to this method of when an open goal works, how long it works for, and how and when does somebody make that sufficient transition into being able to use and adopt effectively something like a specific challenging goal? So the running was apt. It was an appropriate thing to draw on a 10K there, Dan.
and would you be willing to answer the football one? When you think about clutch and flow, that must relate, surely.
I think certainly for me, that's going a bit beyond where I'm at in terms of I'm focusing on the physical activity. But maybe Trish would be able to comment a little bit more on the flow and clutch from a sporting perspective.
Maybe from a Carmogie perspective.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I guess from my perspective, I've always been just interested in kind of exploring potential and how far you can go with things, and I guess from a sporting perspective, I often think about the barometers that we often use in terms of our performances, and for me, I think what I always quite liked from the point of view of something more like a non-specific goal was whilst winning and success and all of that was more measurable and so on. For me, I guess it's still a metric that is very much other referenced and it's reliant on others. So certainly when I was playing over the last number of years, whilst I guess the scoreboard is what many will judge you on at the end, I was always interested in, I suppose, exploring my own and my team's potential. And that was right down into training. That was, I guess, the approach I always used in terms of being able to push yourself right out to the line if you're doing sprints and so on. So yeah, I think from my perspective, it's been able to identify that there are probably scenarios where these goals may be more beneficial, and these different types of goals, and then being able to draw upon them at those times is really key. So yeah, from my perspective, I think it's again being able to move away from that one size fits all approach and seeing what's going to work in those particular scenarios.
As you were talking there, Trish, I was thinking about, because you talk about outcome metrics. So I'm thinking of goal achievement theory here. I'm thinking of that classic binary notion of ego versus task orientation. So getting away from ego. But really, if we don't have specific goals, maybe we're not task oriented. I mean, in my own consultancy, in my own practice, I tend to talk to and co-create task objectives that are more sort of specific and controllable and positive as in approach with clients. But it almost feels away from that kind of goal achievement theory and task orientation onto that curious, exploratory, let's go out and see what we can do. It's almost like those open goals align more with, self-determination here, more so than a goal achievement. There's choice, go out, enjoy this, see how you do, see where that takes you, a curiosity and exploration. I'm just rambling now, but this is what I'm thinking about. So let me pose this about that idea. Is that in the world of, if we remove ourselves from participative sport and we start perhaps thinking more about competitive sport, that as a consultant feels like a more scary place to visit, because you're dealing with players, people, competitors who very much. I mean, you talked there, Trish, at the beginning about becoming the sixth best team in Ireland in what you were doing, and that's you and your teammates would have been very serious about what you're doing. Can that bear relationship with just being curious and just striving to have an enjoyable experience? Or do we have to be more task oriented? You've answered this already, but it's just thoughts flying in and out of my mind here.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point, and I think certainly from my perspective, yeah, I think for me it was probably almost being exploratory in terms of that task orientation in many ways. So
Gotcha. You're bringing them together.
yeah, so being able to not necessarily put a fixed endpoint on how you want to execute a task, for example. So for me, certainly from my playing perspective, it was always, very much, if you get the performance right, the scoreboard, you would hope, looks after itself. And if it doesn't, maybe it's just that on the day you weren't good enough. So for me, it was almost, if you can do as well, in terms of, or just see how well you can perform, that was always really key. And I think certainly from that perspective in training, it was very much similar. And yeah, I think it's a really interesting question that you pose there in terms of from an applied perspective. And certainly from, this recent work that we're doing at the minute, in which we're kind of starting to write up and to reach the later stage of our analyses, was for a lot of the athletes, he describes initially setting more of a non-specific open goal, for example, before a race. And for many of them, it may have been maybe early on in the season, or maybe they, hadn't necessarily known what type of form they were in coming into a race. So for them, actually setting a more open goal was probably pretty logical and practical to do, because they didn't necessarily have that kind of barometer to aim for. They weren't necessarily as kind of confident in terms of predicting how they may perform. But then equally for others, it may have been, that actually having a specific goal, especially for those maybe in much longer races, or maybe where they were much newer to a race, again, it made sense to do it because they weren't necessarily certain on what they could achieve. So I think there's a lot more work that we need to do in this area, and certainly this work is very new in terms of looking at some of these ideas. But I think if we even go back to some of Christian's work around this, highlighting that in contexts that involve novelty, experimentation, exploration, that this is when the athletes tend to describe these more non-specific open goals. So as you said there, it is probably one of those elements that, again, we need to develop further in terms of applied practice. But there are some insights thus far that I think might be of use.
What I'm hearing there is we can be task oriented, but we can explore our capacities around those tasks, that we don't have to necessarily set ourselves outcome goals or performance goals. We don't have to necessarily have KPIs, key performance indicators, but we can be task oriented, but just explore how competently can we actually execute our tasks, and there's an open goal there in terms of our performance and in terms of our outcomes. Let's see where we end up here. But let's just explore how well we can execute our tasks. Would I be kind of hearing you correctly there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary that you've put together there.
Okay. Think about it far too much. That's what it is, Trish. Brilliant. Hey, look, absolutely fascinating stuff. And I love... I don't think enough of us talk enough about the differentiation between flow and clutch. I think that's such a fascinating line of investigation. And I also think the line of investigation around physical activity, the mediating participation in physical activity being the experience people are having rather than the outcomes, the benefits. I think that's just so interesting and could really lead to behavior change. So I know that there's going to be so many people listening in who will be as interested as me, which equals very interested. So how can people find both of your works? How can people follow you? I know you're both on social media. And how can people get in touch if you desire to be gotten in touch with? Rebecca, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. So my email is rhawkins@lincoln.ac.uk. So definitely feel free to email me. I'm more than happy to chat all things research. And if anything that I've sort of talked about from my research area is prompting and interest from you, then by all means do get in touch. And as Dan's mentioned there, I am on Twitter, so I think that's _Rebecca Hawkins. And if you follow me, you can see a lot of my work that's on there. You definitely don't have to follow me. You can just look at my profile and see everything. It's all on there. And yeah, you can keep up to date with our latest work that's on there as well.
It is compulsory to follow Rebecca Hawkins. And Trish, how can people find you and follow you and get in contact?
Yeah, so you'll find me on Twitter at Trish_Jackman. You'll find me on LinkedIn as well. So if you search for me there, I'll also be available on email. So please do feel free to reach out and get in touch, whether it's in relation to anything we've discussed today, or in relation to any of the work. So you'll be able to email me on pjackman@lincoln.ac.uk. And also, much of our work is available for you to read, for example, on our ResearchGate profiles or through our staff profiles at the University of Lincoln. And also, if there's anyone wants us to send any work to them, if they're interested in reading some of the papers we've discussed, if the link isn't in the show notes, you'll be able to follow up with us and we'll get in touch.
Perfect. Well, look, thank you so much to you both for joining us today on the Sports Site Show.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you.
Wow, everybody, I really enjoyed that. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Site Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.